The summer of 1983 settled over southern Georgia, with a heavy, humid stillness that made the nights feel endless. In the small town of Valdosta, where pine trees swayed slow and tall above red clay roads, life moved at a gentler pace. People left their doors unlocked. Children played barefoot until dusk. And the biggest commotion most evenings came from the rattle of cicadas and the distant whistle of a freight train passing through town. Among those who called Valdosta home was a young woman named Lynette Caldwell, 26 years old, a teacher at the local elementary school. She lived alone in a small rented cottage on the edge of town, the kind with a creaky porch swing and flower boxes she tended before sunrise. Her students adored her. She was known for her patience, her soft voice, and her habit of humming while she wrote lesson plans. To most who knew her, Lynette's life seemed ordinary, steady. She had grown up in nearby Thomasville, attended Valdosta State College, and stayed after graduation because she said she loved the quiet of small-town life. She had a boyfriend for a while, but by 1983 she was on her own again, focusing on her work and helping her younger sister plan a fall wedding. That July, the air was thick with heat, and thunderclouds built almost daily along the horizon. On the night of July the 9th, a Saturday, Lynette had dinner with two friends at a diner off Patterson Street. They lingered late, laughing over slices of peach pie, then said goodnight around 10 p.m. The friends later remembered she'd seemed content, no signs of worry, no hint that anything was amiss. She mentioned needing to stop for gas on her way home. She never made it. By Sunday morning, her car was found abandoned on a quiet county road about 3 miles from her house. The driver's door stood slightly ajar, and the keys were still in the ignition. A half-empty cup of sweet tea sat in the console, the ice melted down to water. There was no sign of a struggle inside the car. But the driver's seat was pushed too far back for her height. When her parents couldn't reach her by phone, they drove in from Thomasville, panic sharpening with every unanswered call. By Sunday evening, police organized a search party. Volunteers from the church brought flashlights and combed through nearby woods and ditches. Calling her name, sheriff's deputies interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who had seen her after leaving the diner. One clerk at a gas station off Highway 84 said she remembered a woman matching Lynette's description, buying a soda and paying with exact change around 10:15 p.m. The clerk also recalled a brown pickup truck idling at the far pump, engine running, a man inside watching as the woman drove off. No one ever found that truck. The following days blurred into a haze of news reports, flyers, and unanswered questions. The Valdosta Daily Times printed her photo, a smiling young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair, wearing a denim jacket, beside the headline, "Local Teacher Missing." Her students wrote notes and taped them to the classroom door. Her father appeared on local TV, his voice cracking as he pleaded for information. For a week, the town searched. Police dogs followed a scent from the car toward a wooded area near a creek, but lost it about half a mile in. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent agents to assist, but without witnesses, without new evidence. The trail ran cold almost immediately. Then, 9 days after she vanished, a fisherman found what appeared to be a torn scrap of fabric caught on a branch by the Withlacoochee River, about 6 miles downstream. Deputies followed the riverbank for several hours. Late that afternoon, they found her body. It was discovered partly submerged in the shallows, concealed by brush. She had been dead for days. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, followed by drowning. The autopsy also indicated sexual assault. The crime shook the community to its core. By that evening, Valdosta no longer felt safe. Women stopped going out alone after dark. Parents told their daughters to call before leaving anywhere. And for the first time in memory, front doors that once stood open through the night were locked. Detectives questioned dozens of people. They interviewed co-workers, ex-boyfriends, and even delivery drivers who might have passed her route home. One by one, leads dried up. There was no clear suspect, no fingerprints in the car, and no usable DNA. The science simply wasn't advanced enough yet. The sheriff at the time, Bill Crawford, told reporters, "We're working this case every waking hour. Somebody out there knows something." But that summer turned into fall and the calls stopped coming. The missing posters weathered, the ink fading in the heat. Lynette's funeral was held in the same church where she had once sung in the choir. The sanctuary overflowed. Her students placed small drawings of apples and hearts beside her casket. Afterward, the case file sat on a shelf in the sheriff's office, labeled Caldwell, Lynette, Homicide 1983. Over the years, detectives came and went. The town moved on the way small towns do, slowly, cautiously, carrying the memory like a bruise beneath the surface. Her parents never did. They left her bedroom untouched, textbooks stacked neatly, a vase of dried flowers still on the nightstand. Her father retired early and spent his days tending the yard, his eyes always drifting toward the road whenever a car passed. Her mother joined a local victims advocacy group, writing letters to state legislators about funding for unsolved cases. Each Christmas, they placed a single candle in the window saying it was for Lynette. By the 1990s, the case had faded from public conversation. The sheriff's department digitized old files, and Lynette's ended up in a grey box along with dozens of others labeled unsolved. Most of the evidence, her clothing, the seatbelt, a sample of hair collected at autopsy, was stored in sealed paper bags inside the evidence room, climate-controlled but rarely touched. Then in 2001, a young deputy named Tom Ellison transferred into the department. On his first week, he came across Lynette's case while reviewing cold files. The photographs struck him, the innocence of her smile against the brutality of what had followed. He made a quiet promise to himself. Someday, when technology caught up, he'd reopen it. He didn't know it would take more than 20 years. Back in 1983, the idea of using DNA to solve crimes was barely taking shape overseas. By the 2000s, the science was transforming investigations everywhere, but in small counties like Lowndes, resources were limited. Old evidence often sat waiting for funding that never came. Ellison kept pushing. In 2017, after moving up the ranks to detective, he sent a request to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to review a batch of old cases that might contain viable biological material. Among them was Caldwell Lynette. It took nearly 2 years before he got a call back. The lab technician's voice on the line was calm but deliberate. "Detective Ellison, you might want to come down here." Inside the GBI lab in Atlanta, technicians had carefully re-examined a swab taken from under the victim's fingernails. A tiny, degraded sample that earlier testing methods couldn't interpret. Using newer extraction and amplification techniques, they had managed to build a partial DNA profile. It was enough for a match, not to someone in Georgia's criminal database, but to a profile in a national genealogy system, a relative distantly connected, whose DNA had been uploaded years earlier for ancestry tracing. The lead pointed investigators toward a family living less than 50 miles from Valdosta. Among them was a man now in his 60s, who once worked as a mechanic near the gas station where Lynette was last seen alive. His name appeared nowhere in the original file. Detective Ellison felt a chill as he turned the page of the old report. The faded handwriting from 1983, listing every known contact, and realizing this man had never been interviewed. The past was about to surface again, and this time it was carrying a name. Detective Tom Ellison drove north to Atlanta with a file box on the passenger seat, one that had sat untouched for nearly 40 years. The folders inside smelled faintly of dust and old paper, their corners softened from time. As the highway curved through pines and open farmland, he couldn't shake the weight of what he was carrying. Somewhere inside that box lay the key to a story that had haunted Valdosta, since before he'd finished elementary school. At the Georgia Bureau of Investigations lab, a forensic specialist named Dr. Karen Holt met him at the door. She was middle-aged, with streaks of gray in her hair and a quiet steadiness in her eyes. Holt had been part of a small team reanalyzing old evidence samples from across the state. When Ellison arrived, she handed him a sealed envelope marked DNA. Partial match, familial link confirmed. "The sample you submitted," she said, "contained trace male DNA. We ran it through CODIS, no direct match. But when we expanded the search using genealogy databases, we hit on a family cluster in southern Georgia. 3 individuals showed partial kinship patterns, likely cousins to your unknown subject." Ellison nodded slowly. "So what does that mean in real terms?" "It means," she said carefully, "we may know who he's related to, and from there we can work backward." It was a delicate process. Investigators began building a family tree using public records, census data, and local birth certificates. The branches led them to one man who fit both the age range and geographic proximity: Charles Ray Duncan, 62 years old, retired, living in a small town called Quitman, about 20 miles west of Valdosta. In 1983, he would have been in his 20s, working as an auto mechanic at a garage near the same gas station where Lynette was last seen alive. When Ellison found that detail in the archives, a shiver ran through him. Duncan's name had never appeared in the case file, not once, which meant either he'd slipped through the cracks or someone back then had missed him entirely. By early 2021, Ellison coordinated with the GBI to discreetly collect a new DNA sample. Agents followed Duncan to a local diner where he drank coffee every morning. When he discarded a cup and napkin, technicians retrieved them and rushed the items to the lab. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The match was undeniable. The profile aligned perfectly with the male DNA recovered from beneath Lynette Caldwell's fingernails. Ellison sat alone at his desk for a long time that evening, the soft hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. In the dim light, he opened the folder to her photograph, the same school portrait that had stared up from newspaper clippings decades earlier. "We found him," he whispered. "We finally found him." The next morning, he drove to the sheriff's office and briefed the team. Some of the older deputies who'd grown up in town looked stunned. For years, they'd heard the Caldwell case spoken about like a ghost story, one of those tragedies no one expected to ever see resolved. On April 17, 2021, shortly after sunrise, Ellison and a GBI task force drove quietly into Quitman. The morning was cool, fog rolling low across the fields. At 6:15 a.m., they pulled up outside a small single-story house with peeling white paint. Duncan was sitting on the porch, a coffee mug in his hand. "Mr. Duncan," Ellison said as he approached, badge visible, voice steady, "we need to talk to you about an investigation." The man looked confused at first, but when Ellison mentioned the name Lynette Caldwell, something in his eyes flickered. Not recognition exactly, but something colder, like fear fighting to hide beneath indifference. He was taken into custody without incident. Back at the sheriff's office, he denied everything, claimed he didn't remember any Lynette, said he'd never hurt anyone, said he'd lived an honest life. But as the interview continued, small cracks began to show. When asked if he'd worked near Patterson Street in the summer of 1983, he nodded reluctantly. When shown an old photo of the gas station, he looked away. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. Investigators laid out the lab report, the chain of custody documentation, and the partial family link that led to him. For the first time, his calm cracked. "That was 40 years ago," he muttered, eyes darting between the detectives. "You can't prove nothing," but they already had. Later that afternoon, Ellison phoned Lynette's sister, Janine, now in her late 50s. She lived outside of Tallahassee and had long given up hope that her sister's killer would ever be caught. When she heard the words, "We've made an arrest," she went completely silent. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. Ellison's voice softened. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to hear it from me." After the call, Janine sat in her kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the faded photograph of her sister taped to the refrigerator door. For so many years the image had been frozen in time. A young woman smiling in the sunlight, her whole life ahead of her. Now at last, that picture could rest. News of the arrest spread fast through Lowndes County. The Valdosta Daily Times ran a front-page story. Arrest made in 1983, murder of local teacher. For older residents, it felt like stepping back in time. Calls poured into the sheriff's office from former neighbors and classmates, people who'd lived through that summer and never forgot the fear that followed. One caller said, "I remember seeing that man's truck near the gas station back then. It was always parked crooked by the payphone." For the investigators, every new lead became a piece of a puzzle long buried under dust. They retraced old witness statements, reconstructed the timeline, and confirmed Duncan's employment records. In July 1983, he had been working late shifts and often drove home along the same route Lynette took that night. When presented with this evidence, he said nothing. By summer 2021, the case went before a grand jury. The indictment charged Duncan with murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. The courtroom filled with reporters and residents who had lived long enough to see the impossible happen. A case older than many of them finally breathing again. During the arraignment, Ellison sat quietly in the back. He didn't take satisfaction in the arrest. There was no victory in seeing an old man in handcuffs, only the knowledge that truth had finally found its way through the silence. For Janine, attending that hearing was like walking through a dream. She watched Duncan's profile as he stood before the judge, his posture stiff, his expression blank, and thought about how many birthdays, holidays, and sleepless nights had passed since her sister's death. The years had eroded everything except the ache. Afterward, she stood outside the courthouse under the Georgia sun, tears streaking her face. "She finally has a name to stand against," she told reporters. "All this time I just wanted that." Back at the sheriff's department, Ellison and his team revisited the evidence once more, preparing for trial. The DNA report was clear. The fingernail scrapings matched Duncan's genetic profile, with a probability exceeding 1 in a quadrillion. But there was more, small details that painted a fuller picture. Fibers found on her clothing, once considered insignificant, matched carpet from a model of truck Duncan had owned in 1983. A co-worker from the auto shop later testified that Duncan occasionally showed up to work with scratches on his E. Arms forensics could now explain things that 1983 investigators couldn't have imagined. Back then, the idea of microscopic trace evidence linking two people seemed futuristic. Now it was fact. As the trial neared, the prosecution built its case piece by piece, careful not to overstate but confident in the evidence. The defense argued that the DNA transfer could have been incidental or contaminated, that too much time had passed, that memory and science both could fail. But the jury would soon hear the story of how the sample had been preserved, sealed, logged, and untouched for decades, waiting for the day the technology would exist to decode it. Before the trial, Janine visited her parents' graves in Thomasville. She brought fresh flowers and placed them beside the shared headstone where her sister's name was carved beneath theirs. "We're almost there," she whispered. "They're finally going to know." She stayed until sunset, the sky glowing orange through the trees. It had taken nearly 40 years, but justice was finally at the door. And in Valdosta, the people who still remembered the summer of 1983, the fear, the candlelight vigils, the unanswered questions, began to feel something they hadn't felt in decades, peace. But the story wasn't over yet. Because when the courtroom doors opened months later and testimony began, the truth that emerged would reveal more than anyone had ever expected. The courthouse in Lowndes County was packed on the first morning of the trial. Reporters lined the steps before dawn. their breath fogging in the cool air as trucks from Atlanta and Savannah news stations idled nearby. Inside, every bench was filled. Former classmates, old teachers, police retirees, and townsfolk who had waited nearly 40 years to see justice speak the name Lynette Caldwell out loud again. When the defendant was brought in, the murmurs quieted. Charles Ray Duncan, now 62, looked smaller than the mugshot that had run in the newspapers months earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he took his seat at the defense table. He wore a wrinkled gray suit that didn't quite fit, his hair neatly combed, his expression a careful mix of confusion and irritation, as though he still couldn't understand how the past had found him here. Prosecutor Martha Gillis, a veteran from the state's attorney's office, stood to begin the case. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and heavy with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case began on a warm August night in 1983. A young woman named Lynette Caldwell left work and never came home. For decades, her family asked who could have done such a thing. The evidence, sealed and preserved all these years, has finally answered that question." She walked to the evidence table and placed a photograph of Lynette on the stand. The room fell silent. "This," she said softly, "is the woman whose life was stolen." The first witnesses were familiar faces from the old investigation. Retired officers, forensic techs, even the gas station clerk who had been working that night. His hair was white now, his voice thin but steady. "I remember she bought a bottle of soda," he said. "She smiled, said goodnight, then got into her car. I never saw her again." When asked if he remembered anyone else near the pumps, he hesitated. "There was a truck, faded blue, parked near the payphone. I can't swear it was him, but seeing his face today, I remember that truck." Across the room, Duncan stared down at his hands. Then came the science, the testimony that bridged 4 decades of silence. Dr. Karen Holt took the stand, describing how her team recovered, preserved, and reanalyzed the biological material from beneath Lynette's fingernails. She explained the concept of mitochondrial degradation, of polymerase chain reaction amplification, and of the genealogical triangulation that had led to Duncan's distant relatives. The jurors listened closely, many of them too young to remember a world without DNA testing. When the defense cross-examined, Attorney Paul Reddick tried to undermine the chain of custody. "Doctor, can you confirm that the sample was never touched or mishandled in 40 years?" "Handled, yes," Holt said calmly. "Mishandled, no. It was sealed in 1983, logged under evidence item 14B, and reopened under my supervision in 2019. The chain of custody is unbroken." Reddick shifted tactics. "Is it possible, even remotely, that DNA could transfer through secondary contact?" "In certain cases, yes," she replied, "but not here. This was found deep beneath the victim's fingernails, mixed with her own blood. That indicates direct physical struggle." The courtroom was silent again. Every sound, every shuffle of paper, every whisper, seemed to vanish beneath the gravity of her words. When it was Janine's turn to testify, she walked slowly to the stand. The years had carved gentleness into her face, but her voice carried quiet strength. She described her sister's kindness, her laughter, the way she'd help neighbors without being asked. "She was supposed to be a teacher," she said softly. "She wanted to help kids who didn't believe in themselves. And then one night she was just gone." The prosecutor asked, "What has it been like waiting all this time for an answer?" Janine swallowed hard. "It's like carrying a ghost. You live, but part of you doesn't." Across the room, Duncan stared at her for a moment. For the briefest second, something flickered in his expression. Guilt, regret, or perhaps the sudden understanding that this wasn't just evidence and testimony. These were lives he had crushed under silence. Later that afternoon, the jury heard from the state's forensic reconstruction expert, who used photographs and diagrams to illustrate how Lynette's injuries matched signs of struggle. "She fought back," he said firmly. She fought hard. Reddick objected, but the judge overruled. The prosecutor's closing argument that day was brief but devastating. "You heard the science," she said. "You heard the memories. This case is not about speculation. It's about truth. Truth preserved in evidence, in blood, in time. The defendant thought the years would protect him. But time doesn't erase guilt. It only waits for justice to catch up." When it was the defense's turn, Reddick leaned on doubt. "This case is built on fragments," he told the jury. "Science evolves. Memory fades. You cannot convict a man on probability. 40 years have passed. 40 years of contamination, of lost witnesses, of errors no one can account for." He pointed toward Duncan. "He's not a monster. He's an old man. The state wants you to fill in gaps with emotion. Don't let them." But the jurors weren't looking at Duncan. They were looking at Lynette's photograph, still displayed near the bench, her smile frozen in time. After closing statements, the jury retired. The wait stretched into hours. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, broadcasting updates for evening news. Inside, Janine sat in the front row, hands clasped together so tightly they trembled. Around 8 p.m., word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The judge called everyone back into the courtroom. The sound of footsteps echoed off the marble walls. Duncan sat rigidly at the defense table, his jaw clenched. The foreman rose. His voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Charles Ray Duncan, guilty of murder in the first degree." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Janine covered her face and wept. The prosecutor exhaled quietly, her shoulders shaking. Even the bailiff, a man who'd worked hundreds of trials, blinked back tears. Duncan showed no emotion. He simply stared forward, lips pressed into a thin line as if trying to will himself out of existence. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Duncan, you took a young woman's life and stole decades of peace from her family and her community. Justice may have been delayed, but it was not denied. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." There was no applause, no outburst, only quiet sobbing and the faint scrape of chairs as people stood. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. The town that had carried Lynette's name for nearly half a century finally exhaled. That night, Janine returned to her sister's old home, a small, single-story house that had been sold and resold over the years. The current owners let her walk through one last time. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine, but she could still sense her sister there, in the worn grooves of the floor, in the faded wallpaper, in the echo of laughter long gone. She stood by the window and whispered, "It's over, Lynn. He can't hurt anyone anymore." In the weeks that followed, letters poured into the sheriff's department. Some came from families with their own cold cases, thanking Ellison's team for proving that even decades later justice could still speak. Others came from former Valdosta residents, people who had moved away but never forgotten the summer of 1983. One letter read simply, "You gave us closure. Thank you for remembering her." Detective Ellison kept that letter in his desk drawer. Sometimes late at night he'd read it before going home, a quiet reminder that what they did mattered. Even if the victories came slow, even if the cost was high, the GBI expanded its cold case initiative soon after, using the same genealogical approach to re-examine dozens of other files. Lynette's case became a symbol, proof that evidence never truly dies if it's cared for. That silence can still give way to truth when someone refuses to stop listening. For Janine, life moved forward quietly. She returned to her home near Tallahassee and began volunteering at a victims advocacy center, speaking softly to families who had lost loved ones and were still waiting. She never told them how to feel. She simply listened, the same way others had once listened to her. Sometimes when she drove past fields at sunset, she thought of her sister walking home that last evening in 1980.